All right, welcome everybody to another session of Conversations of Change. And today I have with me here Heather Pickard, the CEO of SHARC. Before we get into the interview in more depth, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're both meeting and also where you might be watching this from, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And the purpose of Conversations of Change is really to hear the human stories that have run alongside, I guess, the collective experience of responding to COVID-19 and particularly in the AOD sector, but also across related sectors. And today I'm really honoured to have Heather with me, and I think I'll hand it over to Heather to introduce herself and her role, and then we can get stuck into it.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. It's lovely to be here and nice to be included in being able to give my perspective, I guess, and our perspective at SHARC of COVID-19 and its impacts. I've been the CEO at SHARC for about 11 years now, but I've worked in the sector for about 25. So prior to this, establishing the Victorian Nurses Health Program, and then prior to that, managing a big suite of services at Monash Health. So 25 years, almost 26 years now in the sector. I'm a nurse, but I've done postgrads in organisational management and addiction studies, and have real interest in kind of how governance works at different stages of these type of journeys, and how we can actually really feel the pulse beat of what's happening at our organisation at the same time as holding the responsibility of compliance, etc. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey for me, both before COVID, but particularly during COVID, challenging and rewarding. So
amazing. And I just will add, I'm not sure where the AOD sector would be if it wasn't for nurses. It seems that many people who have had a long career in the sector have started as nurses. So that's yeah, it's interesting. It's just interesting as an observation.
I think because the clinical arms of detoxification and home-based withdrawal nursing and stuff, where people needed to have a nursing qualification, and a lot of nurses came in on that bridge, and really found that the sector was interesting and exciting and challenging and rewarding, and like me, chose to stay in the space. So I also bring my own lived experience of recovery. So for me, it was very much a passion of my beliefs in people can make change in their lives, meaningful change, but also my professional qualifications, and A&D was just a really good land for me.
Amazing. Thank you, Heather. Thanks for sharing.
Okay.
So the first question that I have is, what are you currently doing for yourself, for your staff, for the people that you serve in the organisation more broadly, to manage the current situation safely, humanely, and with a sense of dignity for everybody involved?
I read that question when you sent it through, and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, it's really an aspiration, isn't it? Like, they're very aspirational kind of descriptions about what we're working towards delivering and developing and holding a tender space, I guess. So, I just want to acknowledge that what am I doing? What are we doing at SHARC? On many levels to try to work towards that kind of quality hold. So yeah, I see it as an aspiration towards that kind of level of good practice. Yeah. But look, I think one of the main learnings for us here has been COVID came very quickly, and we had to mobilise very quickly. And I think we had a few weeks to really realise this is serious. We're going to be shutting down service delivery. How do we manage that? We've got sort of 60 residents in houses. We service over 5,000 families a year. We've got, 18 peer support groups in the community for families. So we run a lot of training. So we had 2 weeks to think about how we could continue to deliver those services without it being a face-to-face means that we delivered it for years. And we made a decision early on that we needed to include all levels of the organisation, including the residents in the houses, in forming our plans. And it was a real temptation, from my point of view, to just get the risk man frameworks out and let's just be compliant with the Deputy Health Commissioner and let's set in safe structures. But the word humane and dignity that, you know, you pose those questions were what came to me when we were thinking about how we would develop it up. And we also knew that what we didn't know was how long this was going to be a holding pattern for. So we needed to have service user full buy-in at an early point in the planning. And it was really interesting because I wasn't the only one that wanted to get the safety plans and the management plans out. We all felt a bit of anxiety around that. But you know, what stood the test of time has been, that was a really helpful process to bring all the housing residents in via Zoom, and we had meetings here, and the families met in the same way. So we are hit with a situation in the community. We are a community service that serves you in this way, and we're all going to have to find a way to navigate this together. And being willing to put down the kind of solely professional hat of the person that delivers the services and separation from, you know, a professional boundary, and kind of try to work together to create a new way of operating. And that, I think, was one of our wisest calls. You know, we've had extraordinary, so what we did was we brought community together and we looked at the needs. I needed to develop a business management and continuity plan. And so it needed to be compliant, safe, effective, all those kind of terms. But we needed buy-in from the people that we serve. So we made sure that the language was accessible, that our planning document was created in, and we made sure that it was designed in the way that at our regular checkpoints along the journey, that the design was already in place to include representation of the people that we're here to serve. So, you know, we found that developing up a plain language kind of plan to help everybody stay on the same page through the journey was really helpful. We found that, you know, I think as a service sometimes that has to deal with compliance and reporting and bureaucracy, our language can become inaccessible to people, including staff sometimes. So I
was going to say,
really making
different sectors. Yeah.
So it was really making sure that our languaging was actually accessible to everybody that needed to have buy-in to that plan, and have regular kind of parts along the journey where we'd all come together on Zoom. And it was we didn't just bring in 100 people on Zoom. We had designed a process where each layer of the organisation could collect and communicate that kind of information. So clear planning, being patient with making sure that we brought the right people along on the journey of the planning, so we weren't imposing something. You can't impose something remotely that hasn't got buy-in. So, you know, we recognise that, and then having planning along the way that enabled people to have input. We constantly had to adjust our plan. Like, we didn't just bowl the ball and wait. We constantly had to go in and readjust it as things have changed in the environment. So that's been really helpful. The other thing was this is a staff related issue, but the staff really early on identified that they wanted to have more supervision, more regular supervision. And of course, I put my head in my hands because I'm thinking, like, really? Like, it's going to be hard enough managing your regular supervision slots. And they were really adamant that they actually, they'd never experienced a pandemic before. I actually have overseas at one time. And when I went back in my mind, I remembered that one of the outcomes when we look back on the journey in Canada was that people's requirement for supervision increased. So we set in a framework where we'd have shorter supervision sessions but more regularly with direct line management. And the other thing is we lifted the EAP. We have an EAP service, so, and it has a ceiling on it, and we lifted that. So we recognise that people may need to access the EAP service more than the standard 3 sessions that they get in the plan. Excuse me while I just have some of this. Yeah, so communication involving everybody in that plan, a schedule of regular kind of connecting and contacts at the milestones along the way, increased supervision as a plan, as a part of the plan, not waiting till people were burning out. And despite the fact that I thought that was going to be a nightmare, and increasing the EAP ceiling was really interesting. I've actually asked our EAP service provider, who told me that the demand on the EAP has increased, and I've actually asked them to crunch the numbers for me, because I think that's going to be really interesting. And the other thing that, dignity is an interesting thing, isn't it? When we talk about dignity, and I was also really interested in that word, because one of the things that comes up for me around dignity is the dignity of risk. So when we were trying to interpret the health minister's directions around residential services and housing, and it's a very interesting thing to interpret, because a lot of the black and white isn't said in ministerial announcements. That's no criticism. I wouldn't be saying too much black and white either. But then we had to kind of take that interpretation as staff and go to the houses and say, this is what we're reading from this, but you are a community who have initially identified as a family and didn't choose to go to your own homes. So in some ways, you have, part of your dignity is an interpretation of these guidelines as well. So that was a bit scary, really, to be perfectly honest, because from my perspective, because I'm thinking, I'll make the right decision, make the careful decision, but they did, they actually have very good processes in the houses where they worked as a family to look at their interpretation. Interesting, when we got the restrictions lifted a little bit and you could have visitors in a certain number, and I'm going, oh God, 6 residents with 5 visitors each. That means that there's 30 people in the house, and I'm having a fit by myself, because I try to have my fits by myself.
Solo.
Yes, and then I got it together and went back to the communities, and of course they had come up with a really good, orderly, good, sensible plan, very similar to what most of the community have made around those vague kind of restriction lifts. So, I think the dignity is a really interesting thing when you're dealing with people who are in involuntary treatment and a community-based sector who are very much reliant on connectivity and working as a community to assist their recovery journey. It's a really interesting, how do you kind of navigate that space, they did it incredibly well. And when I saw your word dignity in that question, I thought a big part of it for us has been allowing the dignity of risk-taking of any community housing sector that originally identified as a family, and they've stuck to that all the way through the COVID journey. It was, if one's down, that's the home. Everybody else, they really understood the restrictions and the guidelines, and they'd taken on the dignity of being able to have those kind of calls around their own life with our support, and did amazing with it, done amazingly with that. Our job was to continue to inform and make sure that it was translatable, and to stay as a connective kind of host or glue to support them through their journey. And, we haven't had any COVID touch wood, no COVID infection in any of our houses. But more extraordinary has been that they've remained as a community without incidences and huge arguments. You know, that they've somehow managed, like the rest of the community has, to adjust in the main to, you know, the COVID kind of restrictions and lockdowns. So, yeah, so the answer to your question is I see it as constantly aspiring to be agile and responsive and as open-hearted as we can be in the journey, but not feeling like we're the experts who lead this show or control this show, or we are part of a kind of communal effort to do the best that we possibly can with all the different knowledges and lenses and expertise we all bring. And that's been the kind of culture that's driven our response. And I, you know, and that's just not me, that's the staff and the residents and the community. And we also have 58 volunteers at SHARC, and they're very active in the work that we do. So they've been included, and they've just recently come back to working from their own homes rather than the staff actually took over the family work for some time. And then they identified that they actually didn't want to be doing that anymore. They wanted to see if we could stretch further and if we could have the phone lines coming into their own homes, because they wanted to participate in the activities of the family services that we run. And, you know, I just thought, oh no, it's a bit too tricky, you know, like let's just roll. And they were quite robust in coming back to me and saying, you know, we get your head, but, you know, there might be another way. There could be other possibilities here. And you know, Rob and his team then found some other possibilities to bring the volunteers on. You know, so just, I think I've probably said enough about that question.
What I've heard coming through really, really strongly, and it's certainly been my experience as well, that this time has really stripped things back for people. So it's really made clear what the kind of values underpinning people's sense of connection, people's sense of, I guess, responsibility to each other and accountability to each other in terms of keeping safe, which is just an idea of dignity to me, was always around choice and and engagement. Because I don't see, to me, when I think about it as well, in terms of empowerment, I think only individuals can empower themselves. No one else can empower someone, but you can get people to have choice and to have involvement, which I think is, you know, aligns itself with that. And, you know, as for this idea that the question was aspirational, it sounds very much to me as though you've brought that into action. It sounds like you've actually applied that in everything that you've done in holding space. And I think people were so quick to respond because the situation called for quick action, but sometimes the best action is when you've had an opportunity to actually pause and to bring people in and to have a more robust and a broader perspective of views brought into it to have an outcome, you know, that's always going to be more well-informed. Yeah. So it sounds like you've done all of that, Heather.
Well, I think that we probably have aspired to doing all of that. You know, it'll be an interesting reflection with our community post-COVID, you know, about how well we've actually, you know, what kind of success we've had in our aspiration. But I felt like that we've, at each point of review, it's kept growing, the feedback's kept coming, and people have become more determined, i.e. the volunteers, to bring what they've got to the table. And, you know, I think that's part of what I love about human nature, you know, that if you create the space, human beings will often take it. Sometimes I see my role as a designer rather than doing anything. Like you create the framework and roll the ball, and human nature kind of prevails in a really positive way, I think, through what I've seen and experienced from our community.
And that's a beautiful segue into question 2, because that is in essence what question 2 is all about, in the sense that, you know, what opportunities are there for people to contribute, to be a part of this, to have an opportunity to take some action that hopefully post-COVID means that they are able to make a bit more sense out of what's happened and integrate it a bit more meaningfully into their lives. So the question was, how can people support you? You know, how can people support SHARC? Is it advocacy? Is it reduction of stigma, resources, staffing, volunteering? I mean, it sounds like some of those things you already have in place.
Yeah.
But it was just to shape it up. What's the call to action if people want to take part?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to be really important to have mapped this journey and from lots of different lenses. And I think part of your project is really doing that, you know, so that we as a sector and a community sector can look back, and there'll be great learnings from this that we'll bring forward, and great practice that some of it we'll bring forward and some of it we won't. So I, you know, for me, I would like to see more of, you know, a formalised framework for consumer and family member feedback into the mapping of that journey. And I think, you know, all hats off to the department too. You know, in many ways, we were all thrown by a very short run-up time and planning time. So, you know, like I said, APSU's taken that on with the trying to map the consumer experience, both from people on waiting lists, people in services, so from various points of the consumer space. So I think that'll be a valuable piece of work, as will what Butta's doing, you know, with these kind of interviews and trying to, because people's memory fades post a situation. So if you wait till we're all back and having lunch with each other and going to CEO meetings and like back in it, the data you get isn't as rich, of course. So what we can collect and what we can then pull together at a later date when we catch our breath and try to make some sort of sense out of it, I think is going to be critically important. When I think about what does this organisation or this community of people need more of, I don't think we've actually been under-resourced in some ways to do what we've needed to do with the change to remote environment. I haven't had enough time to be out in the community, because we've all been insular, to kind of gauge what, you know, things like stigma and lack of education, what that in itself has had impact on us as service providers. So it's probably not something that the stigma and education and stuff is not something that I would be able to comment on COVID related. But certainly, you know, being able to look back on this time with some clarity and have current data that we've collected during the journey is going to be really important. And the other thing I think we absolutely need to design this kind of pathway for the next time. And everybody goes, oh, we never have another COVID. But I think more and more in our emerging world, we have to be prepared for things like this to come and kind of knock ourselves off our stands for a while. And so one of the critical success factors that we saw in the Canadian influenza 30 years ago when I was there was the ability to map the journey and then design it into a process for, if this comes around next time in human services, what do we do? So, you know, the tendency will be for us all to just be so delighted to be back and business as usual, but with circles around where we can stand. And, you know, there'll be some fundamental rules, but essentially we'll all be so pleased to be back together that, you know, business as usual with the new rules will get integrated and begun pretty quickly. But we really need to capture the journey of this, like who got a good Guernsey, who didn't, what else did we need to do to engage service users. And I think, you know, what we see with the data management, and, you know, it's great that, that it was realised that a lot of consumers wouldn't have the kind of IT or data plans to be able to engage in a meaningful way with services. But, again, what we've seen is how long it takes to actually get money through government, through department, out to services in a meaningful, informed way. And that's no critique on anybody. That's just one of the things that we've seen. So those kind of infrastructure needs, I think we can plan and put into a bit of a blueprint for a possible another time when we have to lock down for whatever kind of reason that might be. It might not be COVID-19, it might be some other thing.
Climate change is still looming.
Yes, and absolutely. So, yeah, actually mapping the journey is critical, and then taking the time while we're all still fresh to have a look at that and put it into some usable corporate memory almost, so that we can access that should we come across something similar. And I think it's the next question, but also working out what do we keep and what do we let go. Like we've all learned in a human service delivery where connectedness is such a critical part of how we engage with people, and yet we've needed to adjust and create these kind of platforms to have quite deep conversations with people at times who are in a vulnerable space. So what part of that is still a good thing to keep, and what will we let go? And I'll give you a very small example. For many years, we've been trying to create a family support group, peer support group for families in a very furthest most part of regional Victoria. And we've never been successful at it. Doesn't matter how many buses we've organised or people to pick up, and we just haven't. It's just been too hard for those families to leave their farms and actually access what we've wanted. Many regional groups have been successful, but not this particular area. Yet when we had to and we went on Zoom, we said, let's just include them in this and see if they want to get on board. And those families in that very remote part of Victoria came on board and now have a very strong support group. So there's some parts of the cohort of potential service users, including families, that I don't think we've been able to reach despite our attempts. I'm not just saying SHARC, I mean many services. So sometimes, even though Zoom might not be the best option because it's, a bit inhibitive to connection, it may be the only option for some people. And sometimes only options are better than none.
Correct.
So there's about 12 people now attending this group, and we just had given up. So that's the kind of deep dive I think we all need to go on in our services when we look at, not only as services internally, but as a sector-wide, what has worked well and what can we keep as part of our practice. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater because it's not as connected as we'd like to be. So I think that's...
Often we have this idea of one way of doing things and we just keep trying until it works, rather than hitting a pause and just going, hang on a moment, maybe this isn't working. What else? What other? How do you still hold on to the intent and the purpose, but just do it in a different form? Which I think this totally has brought about. And again, it's that idea of creating enough time for reflection and enough time to really actually understand what's taken place and what's occurred, as opposed to this real push to just go back to normal to some degree. I don't think there is no normal anymore.
No.
Even the new normal is not normal in that sense, because it's still a transition kind of phase, but that it doesn't have to just be about going back to what we've done. There's actually still that sense of possibility and hope in that.
And I feel that, and quite strongly. And also some of our younger people in houses have been amazingly skilled in teaching us how to use some of the remote platforms and stuff, and that is an amazing thing when we share skill sets with all of our community. So you know, Sharks has a very vocal community, and that's hasn't been diminished because of COVID. In many ways, you know, it's enhanced it because I feel like we're on these kind of platforms most of the day, which we're all looking forward to not being on. That is incredibly tiring. You know, like 6 or 7 a day, but yeah, just that like you said, that ability to reflect what has worked well and what could be developed up. And I know I said I wasn't going to say much, but I always say that and I always do say a lot. The other thing is thinking about staff. You know, we've always gone, everybody has to be on site. You know, that's how you do your 9 to 5 job. You come to work and you work in an office and that's your base. And what I'm really looking at SHARC with leadership and everybody else for sure is how can we be the most flexible that we can to enable and enhance workforce wellness while still serving in a really effective quality way the people that we serve. So what's the kind of bare minimum, or not even bare minimum, what's a healthy way to look at how much time staff actually have to spend in cars driving to work? You know, what's the kind of minimum for that to run a quality service, and how can we be a bit more flexible? And as we've made a strategic decision to make sure that our ageing workforce is being replaced by a younger workforce, we've strategically recognised the need to do that. Then you bring in staff who have young children and have all kinds of you know, needs and considerations around that. So it's been a really good opportunity for us to think about, a bit like you say, we've always done it like this, so this is how it has to stay. But I've worked overseas where there are much more flexible distance working models that are available to people. And people still, you know, there's this idea that if you haven't got staff in a building, and I don't know who has this idea, I might have once, but if you don't have staff in a building with the right management, that you're not going to get the best output maybe from them, and they're not being monitored, right? But actually, I don't find that's real. You know, I find that's, you know, if you haven't got a way of getting the best out of your staff, then over monitoring them isn't going to give you that. So how,
exactly.
No, that's right. So how do we come out of COVID looking at flexible distance working, I guess you'd call it. Remote working sounds a bit weird. It sounds like you're not really there because you're actually, so, you know, distance working, how can we look at that when we come back and make a bit more of a flexible model for our staff, particularly our younger staff with families, and maybe our older staff needing some more time working from home, but making sure that the quality of our service isn't dented by that. In fact, I believe, I've got a strong suspicion it could be enhanced by that. Yeah.
There's this new thinking saying that, you know, the concept of work-life balance is quite outdated and also not necessarily helpful, that it's more around work-life integration. And it's, the more that, you know, you're doing work that aligns with your values and purpose and sense of self and identity is expressed and all of those things, you know, it does allow for that greater sense of integration, but it also speaks to the way in which you work too. So how work and life can become more blended, as opposed to this thing that life happens outside of work. You have to do your work and that's it, and it happens in this one spot, and then everything else that's, you know, happens outside. Whereas it doesn't have to be like that, which I think you've absolutely just hit on. Yeah.
So that's going to be an interesting, reflection. I'm really lucky that the staff here, I normally have to monitor the other way. So I normally have to reduce their desire to have output, and I'm sure many parts of drug and alcohol are like that. Rather than monitor and try to increase output. So my job will be, I'm sure, very easy as in that way. You know, I don't have that issue, as I don't believe in, you know, drug and alcohol is a very passionate sector where people put out pretty amazing, you know, outputs in difficult situations.
Agreed.
So, whoops, here we go. Whole lot of things have just come up. I'll just dismiss them.
You've got another meeting, I think, to get to, another 3 by the sounds of it.
We've got another question to go.
Well, the last question was, it's always my favourite. I think you have spoken to most of it or some of it in any event.
Yeah.
What is your positive reframe for how this crisis not only creates opportunities for, the work situation and potentially outcomes, but also the collective condition?
Yeah. Look, I think anything profound that moves us off our base point as micro to macro at any level gives an opportunity to truly reflect, and it creates another worldview. So we've all got our worldviews and we all hold on to them, and we do pretty well in our daily lives, and we get challenged a lot, and that's quite comfortable. But when a profound community event such as bushfires and then hit by COVID as well afterwards, we're all thrown off our sort of hold on our worldviews. And I think that is an incredible opportune time to co-create other ways of being and doing and helping, So, and it's interesting part of human nature that we need a profound shift to let go enough of our hold on stuff to be able to really recreate in it's more co-create a new world for us. So I see that as a real opportunity to do that, and I think the other thing that I would say is that what COVID's done is it's created not just drug and alcohol sector, we work with mental health and gambling and the nurses' health. Community services generally have brought an incredible goodwill to each other and the space. And we've all come from heavy duty competitive tendering and reforms and stuff that's been pretty harsh on our collective hearts, and so there's been there's a bit of grief in the sector because of that and a bit of disconnection. And I think what COVID's done, I just get calls all day from people that 3 months ago I was in a competitive tendering round with, this incredible goodwill across the whole of community services to come together and try to support each other. And interesting with the leaders, I think leaders in this time really, everybody earns their dollars, but I think leaders are going to be carrying it into the 3 o'clock in the morning headspace sometimes. And what I've noticed is a sharing of that kind of fragility almost, where we're a sector that doesn't very often share our fragility because, we help other people who are fragile. So there's been, our worldviews have been forced to open up more, and the kind of grief and trauma on the collective sector from reforms and competitive tendering has had a chance to kind of find its own healing space in this. And that sounds odd because this is another level of impact in possibly a really negative way, but I think for some people, that's been a real opportunity of healing. And I'm just amazed at, and my staff are all reaching out to other organisations, and the managers have started this kind of collective where they're ringing each other, and we haven't had an opportunity to come together under a common aim for a long time. So I see it as a healing opportunity as well, and one that's been taken up.
It's a beautiful reframe. I hadn't. I entered the sector after the reforms, so I heard about them, but I didn't experience them. And certainly something that was kind of pretty clear to me is that sense of shared vision, that shared sense of purpose, it just wasn't there. Like everyone had individual sense of purpose, but a shared one. And I think, you're right that you've hit on that. It's kind of exposed. It's exposed some of the still ongoing impacts and more implicit impacts of the reform than the explicit. The explicit can get dealt with. We can talk about intake and assessment.
Yes.
different pathways, but not the implicit and not the human impact.
No, and that's what I'm pointing to, that
Yeah.
kind of communal kind of trauma from it. Even if you're a successful player in the reforms, there was a sense of separation from who you'd previously been an ally with, and there was quite a bit of that. And I think what I've seen in this COVID-19, there's probably not a CEO I haven't spoken to through this couple of months, and even if it's just been briefly, how are you going? I'm doing this. God, it's busy, isn't it? Yeah, you're getting sleep. Yeah, you know, and then I'm seeing my managers do that and the team leaders, and I think, oh, it's so healing. Yeah, so that's kind of what I would say to that question, those 2 points.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think that idea of human connection has come through a few times, and you know, this idea of real empathy as well, real compassion. Yeah. So it's a beautiful reframe. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, it's all right. I'm really happy to talk to you too. I mean, this is probably, we've laughed and smiled at each other while we've been in this space, and that's beautiful, because my next Teams is with a procurement team, so I'll be talking facts and figures. You know, there's no sameness in my day, but it's just been really lovely to connect. And sometimes it's in the talking and the narrative that you find your own truth of it too. I haven't had any time to really, I just printed your questions out a second ago, so haven't had any time to sort of sit with them. So I thank you too, because by the conversation, I've been able to build my narrative around it, and that's helped me as well. So thank you.
Oh, you are so welcome. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, you have a good day.
You
and,
too.
I'll leave this meeting and go to my next. Bye.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.